guys, welcome back to the home in Homestead. Today we will be doing some tomato preservation and we will be making ketchup two different ways. So today I will be trying out two different recipes, and one recipe is a semi-homemade recipe and another is a from scratch homemade recipe for tomato ketchup. So I've already done most of my tomato preservation for the year. So I've done diced tomatoes, tomato sauce, crushed tomatoes, various salsas, pizza sauce, spaghetti sauce, and now is rounding out towards the end of harvest season for the tomatoes, so I thought I would use up the rest of my tomatoes to make some flavorful sauces to add to our pantry. So follow along and see how we make ketchup two ways. So the first thing that we need to do is prepare our tomatoes. So there are a number of recipes for tomato preservation where I will leave the skins on or leave the seeds in, making certain flavorful sauces with the tomatoes. I will go the extra step and peel and de-seed the tomatoes. You can do this a number of ways. One, you can do a traditional method where you decore, blanch, peel the tomatoes, then put them in a hand food mill. You can also use a sauce master, and that removes the skins and the seeds. Or you can do the third method, in which we will be doing today, which is using the KitchenAid mixer with a food mill type attachment. So we will be using the fruit and vegetable strainer set with the food grinder attachment set. So if you already have the food grinder attachment, which looks like this, then you would only need to purchase the smaller additional set of the food and vegetable strainer. If you do not have the food grinder attachment, then you would get the complete set that I mentioned first. I will link both of them in the description box below if, while seeing how I process the tomatoes today, you feel that this is something you want to add to your kitchen. So first off, what we do is take the food grinder attachment here and we remove the little outer ring, and I store the different blade attachments and things in itself. We'll place it off to the side, we won't be needing that. And inside of it, it has the bar attachment that goes into the KitchenAid, and that we can remove and place off to the side as well. We will not need that. All we need is the outer part of the grinder attachment. So on your KitchenAid, you just remove the black tab and place the cover off to the side. And then we will be using the fruit and vegetable strainer attachment. So in the food grinder attachment, we add the metal bar that has a large square end. That'll go into your KitchenAid. There's a little groove on the side that it fits snugly into, and then just tighten a little black screw. Now we will put the central core into the food strainer mill component, and you slide this in. Inside of here there's a smaller square, and that slides right over the top, and the little square grooves on the side of the mill slide into their place, and then you just use the little collar attachment to secure everything in place. Now we'll put the food strainer sleeve over that. There we go, and the tip of the food mill sticks out here, and it has a little splash guard cover. You can put that on. And this set comes with a little attachment used for pushing down whatever you will be processing. I also purchased an additional piece, which is a large hopper tray, and that just slides over the original hopper, and it just gives you a little more surface area and helps keep the messes down. So now we will just do a very quick prep of the tomatoes. So I have a number of Roma tomatoes. This extra step you don't necessarily have to do, but I like to core the tomato and then I cut them in half. The cutting them in half you will likely have to do because it needs to fit inside of the small circle component that is the diameter of the tool used to press whatever you'll be processing through there. So I will decore the tomatoes and then cut them in half. If they're extra large, I will quarter them. So in this bowl will be the seeds and skins, which I will save and do another project with, and the sauce will come out into this first bowl that's closer to the stand mixer. What I like to do is prep a bunch of tomatoes and put them in the little tray attachment, and then they're just ready to smush down and just keep the process going. So as you can see, the seeds and the skins are coming out here and they're going into this bowl, and the sauce is dripping down into this bowl, which I have a measured one so I can keep track of how much sauce I'm going to get from each batch of the tomatoes. So let me prep a bunch more of the tomatoes and we'll get the sauce made. And I found that if you have a countertop with a pull-out cutting board, this works really well to have your KitchenAid set up on your counter, the sauce bowl on the edge with the scraps bowl sitting on the cutting board. But you can do whatever works for your kitchen setup. That was just something that works for me, so I thought I'd mention it for you guys. Okay, so the tomatoes were all prepped, so let's get this sauce made. I like to do that extra step so that I can remove the core and just check over the tomatoes before they go through the food mill. So now we'll just turn the KitchenAid mixer on medium-high. Let's get this made. Okay, so far it has made 2 quarts. Let's add this to the Nesco roaster. And we'll keep making sauce from there. I like to rotate my scraps bowl. And what we have here today in the large bowl is about 12 pounds of Roma tomatoes, which is about 45 tomatoes. So we'll see how much sauce this batch makes. That'll all vary on the style of tomato that you use and its moisture content. I like to use Roma tomatoes for projects such as this: ketchup, barbecue sauce, pizza sauce, spaghetti sauce. I have a video on my homemade pizza sauce if you want to check that out. And that's another good use for Romas or Amish paste style tomatoes. Alright, so let's continue making this tomato sauce. Okay, so that made 5 quarts exactly of tomato sauce. So now I'm going to prep the next 12 pounds of Roma tomatoes, get them through the food strainer, and make another batch of sauce because I'll be doing ketchup 2 different ways. So let me prep the next batch of tomatoes, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so in a matter of minutes we were able to process and create 10 quarts of tomato sauce. We have 5 quarts in each of these Nesco roasters. These are the 6-quart size roasters, and we're doing 2 separate recipes, so I'm doing 2 separate roasters today. If you were to do a very large batch, you could use the 18-quart Nesco roaster oven, and I will link both the 6-quart and the 18-quart Nesco roasters in the description box below. By using the KitchenAid fruit and vegetable strainer with the grinder attachment, we were able to create all of this tomato pulp, which I will be further processing with you guys, so this will not be wasted. I will put this in the refrigerator until I am ready to do that food preservation project. And the method that I used today does a very good job of removing a lot of the liquid out of that tomato pulp, so that'll be ideal for the project that we will be doing together. As I mentioned before, you can certainly do by hand a food mill, as well as you could also use the sauce master. I think it is a valuable skill to know how to process your foods using those methods as well, and I have done that in the past. I started with the hand food mill. When I started to do larger projects, I moved up to the sauce master, and when I did even more food preservation and really started stocking our pantries, I moved on to the KitchenAid setup that we use today. If you do not have a KitchenAid Stand Mixer, that is a bit of an investment piece, but it is very useful in the kitchen. There are so many ways that you can use that stand mixer, and it certainly lasts for years and years, and it's not unheard of to hear about people passing that down generation after generation, even for use in the kitchen, which I did. We had an older one that was handed down, and that was well over 20 years old when it moved on to someone else and we upgraded to the KitchenAid mixer we use today. So both the stand mixer and the attachments that we use today, while they are investment pieces, they are worth making the splurge in order to make your food preservation projects more efficient and to help get more done in the day. So now back to today's recipes. We will first do the semi-homemade recipe, which we have in, I'm not sure if the camera's picking it up well, but this is a pure white Nesco roasting oven, and this is more of a cream off-white one, so I can tell the difference as I'm cooking. But anyway, we'll be doing the semi-homemade ketchup recipe in this Nesco cooker, and so I have the Mrs. Wages ketchup tomato seasoning mix packets. I'll be doing a double batch of that. So that recipe calls for the 12 pounds of tomatoes, which ended up being 5 quarts of tomato sauce, or about 45 Roma tomatoes. So to this roasting oven, we will add the ingredients, which is 3 cups of sugar, I'll mix that in here. And 2 cups of white vinegar, 5% acidity. This will be a water bath canning project, so the vinegar helps with the pH to make this water bath canning project safe. Next, we will add 2 cans of tomato paste. This will just help add a nice rich tomato flavor and help thicken up the sauce. Now we will add 2 packets of Mrs. Wages ketchup tomato seasoning mix. So I'm going to turn the roaster oven to 350 degrees. And that'll help start dissolving and cooking down some of these ingredients. It's pretty full right now, but as it cooks, it'll cook down pretty quickly and some of this liquid will evaporate. And by the time it's done, a lot of this liquid will have evaporated in order for us to have a nice thick ketchup consistency. In order to get to the base of this roaster oven, kind of help break up some of this tomato paste and seasoning mix, I'm going to use my big whisk. Grab the other packet. So we'll put the cover on. We'll let the semi-homemade ketchup recipe cook. We'll start with 2 hours and then we'll check to see if we need to add more time for it to thicken up and have the consistency that we want for our ketchup. Alright, so the semi-homemade ketchup batch has been cooking for a little while now, and I gave it a taste, and it's very reminiscent of a Campbell's tomato soup, is what it tastes like to me. So I'm going to add something to make it a little more salty and have a little more of a savory flavor to it. So add a 1/4 cup of liquid aminos, and we'll let this cook together. Now let's move over to the homemade from scratch ketchup recipe. So in there, again, we have 12 pounds of tomatoes, about 5 quarts of tomato sauce, and that ended up being about 45 Roma tomatoes. To that we will add 1 can of tomato paste and 1.5 cups of very finely minced onion, which is about 2 medium onions. And I have a Ninja Master Prep set and has a pitcher as well as a small food prep processor, and I use that when I have just a small amount of something to mince real finely, such as the onions in this. Now we will add 1 cup of sugar. And I'll whisk that in again. I'll turn the roaster oven up to 350 degrees. We'll add 1/8 of a cup of salt, and we'll do canning salt since this will be a water bath canning recipe. Now we will add 3/4 cup of white vinegar, 5% acidity, and 3/4 cup of apple cider vinegar. Whisk that in. All right, now for the dry seasonings. We will add 1½ tablespoons of garlic powder, 1 teaspoon of ground black pepper, and 1½ tablespoons of mustard powder. Now let's mix this all together. We'll let this cook down a bit. I'll start with 2 hours and see how it's looking and tasting, and see if we need to adjust any seasonings at that point. All right, so the semi-homemade ketchup is done to my liking. I'm going to turn off the roaster oven here. I will mention that this recipe, I did follow the package of the Mrs. Wage's tomato seasoning mix, the ketchup mix. And on that it said bring to a boil and let simmer for ended up being about a ½ hour, and then there was an option to serve immediately and putting in the refrigerator for at least a ½ hour, and I let it in for even longer than that, and it was still the consistency of about a French dressing, and that's not thick enough for what I'm looking for, as I suspected. So that's why I started with 2 hours of cook time, and it ended up taking 4½ hours of cook time. So I will remove the lid here to show you how it looks. So we've gone down and we've cooked down half of the volume. And it's a nice rich red color, and on the back of the spoon, when I move my finger over it, it leaves a path between where I wiped it. It's a nice thicker consistency, and I put some of it in the refrigerator. And that's a nice thick consistency. It is not as thick as, say, a traditional ketchup, but the flavor profile isn't either. This is a much sweeter ketchup recipe, and I plan to use this more as a base for my sloppy joes. Then I'll add my dry seasonings from my homemade sloppy joe mix. You can check out the recipe on my website, and perhaps with meatloaf, just more of a sweet tomato ketchup type of a sauce rather than true ketchup. I probably would not put this on, say, a hamburger or something like that. Now, if you have tried the Mrs. Wage's ketchup seasoning and I've done it to their specifications and you like it and it turned out for you, that's great. You do that. This is just what I found to be of my preference, and this is more of the consistency that I was looking for. So now what we're going to do is get these into jars. I'm going to do pint jars, and we'll get this into the water bath canner. So while the water bath canner heats up, I was able to get 5½ pints worth of the semi-homemade ketchup using the Mrs. Wage's seasoning packet for the flavoring. So here's a little extra, and I will put that into the refrigerator and likely use that later this week to make some sloppy joes. So here are the 5 pints. I filled them to a ½ inch headspace, wiped the rims, and added the lids and rings just finger tight. Now what I'm doing is I'm cleaning the Nesco. So in order to easily do this, you just fill up the cooking insert with water and some dish soap, and then you put the cover back on and turn it to 350 degrees and let that cook for about a ½ hour. Most cases, most if not all of the cooking residue and the little crusty stuff that forms at the rim of your cooking line will come off, or at least soften greatly. And then if you need to, you can use a little plastic scraper and non-abrasive cloths to get the remainder off. So I just thought I'd show you how I clean my Nesco roaster ovens. This particular batch of the semi-homemade ketchup, there was a lot of cooking residue on this, so this may take a while, but that is a very effective way to clean these roaster ovens. All right, next step is getting these pint jars into the water bath canner where we will process them. All right, so we're over at the water bath canner, take off the lid, double check the temperature, it's where we want it. So I'm going to add the jars. When I water bath can, I put a jar rack on the bottom and then I fill it with water. And then I place the jars right on there. When you fill them, you want the jars to be covered by at least an inch of water. The processing time for this is 40 minutes on the package, so I will do 40 minutes. And then based on the altitude, they have their own criteria of what to increase it by. So if you decide to do this recipe, just check the package and add processing time as necessary based on your altitude. So we'll let these semi-homemade ketchup jars process, and then we'll come back and check out how they look. Okay, so the homemade from scratch ketchup recipe has been cooking. Let's take a peek and let's mix it with the immersion blender so it has a nice smooth finish to it. All right, we'll let this cook down a little bit further so that it thickens up a little bit more. Okay, so the homemade from scratch ketchup is finished. It has been cooking at 350 degrees for 6 hours, and then I used the immersion blender and got the ketchup nice and smooth, and then I finished off cooking it another half hour at 300 degrees. And after I finished immersion blendering it, I put some in the refrigerator, just let it set up, and it's a nice thick consistency. So now we'll take the cover off here and we'll get this placed into pint jars and put into the water bath canner. All right, so we're over at the water bath canner. So let's remove the lid. Check the temperature, we're good. So now we'll add the pint jars of the homemade from scratch ketchup. We'll add them to the water bath canner. And again, I keep a jar tray on the bottom of my canner so that I can place the jars directly on there. And just make sure that the water covers the jars by at least an inch. I ended up with 5 pints and about a 1/4 cup that I will put in the refrigerator for enjoying right now. So now we'll replace the lid. And this is a 20-minute processing time, so I'll set the timer for 20 minutes. And that all depends on your altitude. And as I've mentioned in other canning videos, your altitude dictates how long you should process your canning. So for boiling water method canning, which is water bath canning, here's your altitude in feet. And you would increase the processing time for the recipe by that many minutes based on your altitude. So for this recipe, it is 20 minutes base processing time. So that's what we will be doing. If you need to increase your processing time, please do so. That's important to consider whenever you're canning. All right, so we'll let these jars process. When the time is up, we'll move them over to the cooling and sealing area and take a peek and see how they and the semi-homemade ketchups look. All right, guys, we have finished our ketchup 2 ways. To the foreground, we have the homemade from scratch ketchup, which is a flavorful, hearty tomato ketchup. And to the background, those 5 jars are the semi-homemade ketchup using the Mrs. Wage's seasoning packet as a base for that recipe, and the end result of that particular ketchup, it's much more of a sweeter sauce-like consistency, which I will probably be using the latter for sloppy joe mix base and in meatloaf and other recipes, whereas the homemade from scratch ketchup, I will be using that more so for on hamburgers and hot dogs as a condiment in the more traditional sense of using ketchup. Well, I hope you're having a great day and you're able to get in the kitchen and try out some new recipes yourself. If you enjoy ketchup or tomato-based sauces, either or both of these recipes might be something you want to try out. Well, thanks for taking time out of your day and hanging out with me in the kitchen while we created homemade ketchup and semi-homemade ketchup while trying out these new recipes when we did ketchup in 2 ways. Well, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, and if you enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up. See you next time. Take care.